You walk into a room. It is ordinary by every visible measure: familiar faces, casual laughter, the faint clinking of glasses, or the low hum of conversation. And yet, within moments, the atmosphere shifts. Eyes glance toward you, then quickly look away. A silence, so subtle it might go unnoticed, hovers for an instant before the noise resumes. You haven't spoken. You haven't moved with aggression. You haven't done anything at all. But something about you unsettles the room. We like to believe human beings are rational creatures, judging others on logic, facts, or behavior. Yet countless times throughout history and in everyday life, people respond to one another with reactions they themselves cannot explain. A sudden dislike, a quiet suspicion, a sense of unease around someone who has done nothing to deserve it. This is not reason. This is not evidence. It is something deeper, something invisible that works beneath the surface of consciousness. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent his life exploring the depths of the human psyche, argued that much of what we are and much of what we feel lies beyond our conscious awareness. He called this the unconscious, a vast reservoir of hidden impulses, suppressed emotions, and instincts inherited from centuries of human survival. To Jung, the unconscious was not just an abstract theory. It was a living force shaping human behavior in ways we rarely recognize. When people fear you without knowing why, they are not responding to you in the present moment. They are responding to something much older, an ancient signal, a hidden archetype, a projection of their own unacknowledged fears. You become less of a person in their eyes and more of a mirror, reflecting something within them they would rather not face. This phenomenon has played out throughout history. Consider the solitary thinker, whose silence is mistaken for arrogance, the unconventional artist whose difference is viewed as threat, the political dissenter who evokes hostility before they even speak. Fear, in these cases, is not caused by violence or aggression. It is caused by the presence of someone who stirs the unconscious of others, someone who disrupts the fragile illusions by which people hold their world together. Psychologists call this projection what we repress in ourselves, we often see in others, and when what we see unsettles us, it manifests as suspicion, fear, or even hatred. This explains why people can fear a stranger before knowing their story, or resent a colleague who has done nothing. Wrong. The mind does not wait for evidence. It reacts to symbols, signals, and shadows. This is the invisible fear, the unspoken tension that fills a room when someone carries an energy others cannot process. It is not about violence or danger. It is about the deep, unconscious forces that shape human perception. And to understand why people fear you without knowing why, we must go beneath the surface of reason, into the hidden world of Jung's psychology, where fear is not just an emotion, but a revelation. Carl Jung once wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." To Jung, the shadow was not a poetic metaphor. It was a reality that lurked inside every human being, the parts of ourselves we deny, suppress, or refuse to acknowledge. The shadow is made of everything we do not want to admit about who we are: our hidden envy, our anger, our pride, our selfishness. It is the aggression we tell ourselves we are too civilized to feel. It is the ambition we bury under false humility. It is the desire we pretend we never have when left unacknowledged. The shadow does not disappear. It waits, hidden in the depths of the psyche, until it finds another place to appear. Often, that place is another person. Jung observed this process in his patients. A woman convinced of her own purity would become consumed with hatred toward others she called immoral. A man who believed himself incapable of anger would constantly accuse others of hostility. The qualities they denied within themselves emerged outside, projected onto others who became scapegoats for their inner darkness. This is the secret of why people fear you without knowing why. It may not be you they fear at all. It is the part of themselves they see reflected in you, the qualities they repress but cannot escape. You become a screen onto which they cast their own shadow. Consider how this plays out in daily life. In the workplace, the ambitious individual is often disliked, not because of their faults, but because their drive reminds others of their own lack of courage. In friendships, confidence may provoke irritation because it highlights another's insecurity. On the larger stage of politics, entire groups can be demonized when societies project their unacknowledged violence or corruption onto outsiders, branding them as the problem while refusing to confront the same flaws within history offers chilling reminders of this dynamic. The witch trials of early modern Europe were less about witches and more about projection, societies terrified of their own impulses, anxieties and repressed desires, casting them onto women who became symbols of evil. Totalitarian regimes throughout the 20th century used projection to turn neighbors into enemies, minorities into scapegoats, and fear into political fuel. What people refused to confront within themselves was easier to fight when imagined in others. Jung believed the shadow was universal, present in every person, culture, and era. The more a person insists they have nothing to hide, the more likely their shadow is powerful and dangerous. It thrives in denial, and when they encounter someone who unconsciously activates it, fear becomes the instinctive reaction. This means that when others seem inexplicably uneasy around you, the explanation may lie far beyond your behavior. You might embody qualities that resonate with something buried in their unconscious. You may symbolize freedom to someone who suppresses their independence. You may radiate strength that unsettles those who bury their weakness. Or you may simply remind them of the raw humanity they've spent their lives denying. Jung himself was no stranger to this dynamic. His break with Sigmund Freud was partly fueled by Jung's willingness to explore the darker, irrational depths of the psyche. Ideas Freud dismissed but which resonated with a growing fear of the unconscious. In the scientific community of the early 20th century, Jung became both respected and feared, admired for his insights, but sometimes treated with suspicion for daring to name what others refused to see. The shadow, then, is not just a private matter of individual psychology, it is a social force, shaping how people see one another and how societies define enemies and threats. It explains why a person can walk into a room and trigger unease without speaking a word. They are not simply themselves in the eyes of others, they are a mirror, a reminder, a projection of something unspoken, and the deeper a society or an individual represses the shadow, the more violently it appears when projected outward. To understand this invisible fear, one must understand the shadow. Because only by facing the darkness within can we begin to see others as they truly are, rather than as the carriers of what we refuse to admit about ourselves. Human beings have always carried a primal unease toward what they do not understand. Across cultures and centuries, certain figures consistently emerge as symbols of threat, even when they have done no harm. Carl Jung called these recurring patterns archetypes, timeless characters embedded in the collective unconscious that evoke deep emotional reactions. Among the most enduring of these archetypes are three that explain why people may fear you without knowing why. The stranger, the outcast, and the rebel. The first is the stranger. In the earliest days of humanity, survival depended on the tribe. Those who looked, spoke, or behaved differently could signal danger, disease, competition, or hostility. Millennia later, this instinct remains the unfamiliar face, the outsider in a close-knit group, or even the colleague who simply thinks differently, can awaken suspicion. Fear of the stranger is less about the individual and more about the ancient memory of survival encoded in human psychology. History has shown its devastating consequences. Immigrants, minorities, and cultural outsiders have often borne the brunt of this archetypal fear. Branded dangerous long before they had the chance to be known, closely related is the outcast, the one who does not conform, unlike the stranger, who comes from outside. The outcast is part of the group, but refuses to play by its unspoken rules. They are the one who dresses differently, who challenges traditions, who does not blend into the collective rhythm. To the group, the outcast is unsettling because they reveal the fragility of social order. The witch hunts of Europe were not merely about superstition. They were about punishing those who lived outside the accepted script, widows, healers, and unconventional women who made society uncomfortable simply by existing differently. Even today, the outcast can be seen in classrooms, workplaces, or online spaces, where deviation from the norm often draws ridicule, suspicion, or quiet hostility. Then comes the rebel. If the stranger represents the unknown and the outcast represents difference, the rebel embodies defiance. Rebels do not merely stand apart. They threaten to overturn the order itself. This archetype provokes fear not because of who they are, but because of what they symbolize: disruption, change, the collapse of comfort. Socrates, condemned to death by his own city, was feared not for violence but for questioning too deeply. Nietzsche, dismissed and ridiculed in his time, was feared because his words undermined the moral foundations of his age. The rebel forces society to face uncomfortable truths, and fear becomes the first line of defense. What ties these archetypes together is not real danger but symbolic power. People fear the stranger because they represent the unknown. They fear the outcast because they reveal the limits of conformity. They fear the rebel because they signal transformation. In each case, fear is less about the person and more about what they awaken in the collective unconscious. Even in modern life, these archetypes remain alive. The stranger might be the new employee who stirs unease before they have spoken a word. The outcast might be the student who prefers solitude and becomes the subject of rumors. The rebel might be the whistleblower who exposes hidden truths and is treated with hostility rather than gratitude. These figures remind us that human psychology is still shaped by ancient instincts and archetypal fears, and if you have ever been misunderstood, rejected, or quietly feared for no clear reason, it may be because in the eyes of others you embodied one of these archetypes. To be the stranger, the outcast, or the rebel is not a choice. It is often a role projected onto you by those who cannot tolerate difference, independence, or disruption. But these archetypes, while feared, are also essential. They push societies to grow, to question, and to evolve. To understand why people fear you without knowing why, you must see yourself not just as an individual but as a symbol. In their eyes you may carry the weight of something ancient, something archetypal, something they cannot face. And the more society denies its own shadows, the more it will fear those who embody them. Carl Jung believed that every human being carried within them a reservoir of psychic energy, what he called libido. Unlike Freud, who reduced this to sexual instinct, Jung expanded it into something broader, the life force of the psyche itself. It is the energy that fuels thought, emotion, creativity, and even the way we affect those around us. Most people distribute this energy in fragments, scattered across distractions and daily routines. But there are some who radiate it intensely, and their presence cannot be ignored. This is what we often call an aura, a field of psychological energy that others unconsciously sense. It is not mystical, it is not supernatural, it is the silent impact of concentrated psychic force pressing into the awareness of others. An aura is felt in the stillness of the quiet person who dominates a room without speaking. It is sensed in the leader whose eyes seem to see through masks. It is recognized in the artist or thinker whose intensity unsettles as much as it inspires throughout history. Those who carried such an aura were often both revered and feared prophets who spoke of visions carried an energy that shook entire societies. Revolutionary leaders, whether Caesar or Napoleon, were described not only for their actions, but for the sheer weight of their presence. Enemies feared them not because of what they said, but because of the unshakable certainty they exuded. Even philosophers like Nietzsche or Schopenhauer, though often isolated, carried an intellectual aura, so dense that their ideas reverberated through generations, unsettling people long after their deaths. The aura intimidates because it bypasses reason. People sense it before they can explain it. A charismatic figure may enter a room and immediately divide opinion. Some are drawn closer, others retreat. Psychologists now understand this as a form of unconscious communication. Human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to subtle cues. Tone, posture, energy, silence. When these cues signal intensity, they stir something primal and instinctive, awareness of force, of danger, or of transformation. Modern life offers countless examples. Charismatic public figures, whether artists, politicians, or activists, often radiate an aura that makes them impossible to ignore. Think of leaders whose mere presence silenced crowds, or celebrities whose magnetism stirred both admiration and jealousy. Even in ordinary settings, the phenomenon occurs. The colleague who unsettles others without trying, the student whose quietness draws whispers, the stranger whose eyes linger just a little too long. In each case, the aura is not a performance. It is a concentration of energy that others cannot process without discomfort. Why does aura evoke fear? Because it suggests depth. An aura signals that someone carries more than what is visible, that beneath the surface lies conviction, strength, or vision. Most people prefer predictability. They feel safer around others whose energy is dispersed, familiar, and easy to categorize. The one who radiates intensity threatens this comfort. They become a question without an answer, a presence that cannot be ignored or easily explained. This is why some people are misunderstood from the moment they appear. Their aura presses into the unconscious of others, stirring instincts that feel like danger, even if no harm is intended. The unease is not about violence or malice. It is about the recognition of power, the recognition of difference, the recognition of depth that challenges superficial interaction. Jung suggested that energy flows where attention goes. Those who cultivate self-awareness, who confront their shadow and embrace their individuality, often carry more of this energy consciously. They are not drained by repression or denial. Their presence consolidates, becoming heavier, sharper, more defined. And when others encounter it, they respond in ways they cannot rationalize. The aura, then, is not a mystical gift. It is the psychological residue of self-integration, focus, and authenticity. It is the weight of a soul unfragmented, and in a world addicted to distraction, such presence can be frightening. People sense in it a force. They lack in themselves. They fear it not because it threatens them physically, but because it reminds them of what they could be, yet are not. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, but instead of reflecting your own face, it reflects the hidden insecurities of the person looking at you. This is how fear often works in human relationships. It is less about who you are, and more about what you awaken in others. Carl Jung observed this with precision. People do not simply see others as they are. They see them through the filter of their own unconscious. In particular, they see the parts of themselves they have repressed, the shadow projected onto others. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." In other words, when someone fears you without cause, it is usually not about you, it is about them. Consider the colleague who resents ambition. On the surface, they might accuse the ambitious person of arrogance or selfishness, but beneath the surface, what drives this reaction is their own repressed desire for achievement. To see someone else boldly striving reminds them of their own passivity, their own unfulfilled potential. Their fear is not of the other's success, but of their own failure reflected back at them. Or take the example of anger. Many people repress anger because society teaches them it is unacceptable, dangerous, or unworthy. Yet anger, denied, does not vanish, it festers. And when these individuals encounter someone who displays confidence, passion, or assertiveness, they may feel an irrational fear or dislike. It is not that the confident person is truly dangerous, it is that their presence awakens the buried rage the observer refuses. To acknowledge this dynamic plays out in countless subtle ways. People suppress ambition, then resent the ambitious. They suppress independence, then fear the independent. They suppress desire, then despise those who embody vitality. What they cannot own in themselves, they cast outward, painting others with the colors of their own. Insecurity history reveals this pattern on a grand scale. Societies often demonize precisely what they secretly desire. The Roman elite condemned gladiators as brutish, yet filled arenas to watch them with awe. Puritan societies obsessed over sin, while publicly burning those accused of indulging in it. In the 20th century, regimes projected their own corruption onto enemies of the people, turning ordinary citizens into scapegoats for their insecurities. Projection becomes not just a personal defense, but a collective weapon in everyday life. This mechanism explains why people sometimes recoil from individuals who have done nothing to harm them. Someone who radiates authenticity unsettles those who hide behind masks. Someone who lives freely disturbs those trapped in convention. Someone who embraces their shadow reminds others of everything they have denied within themselves. The fear is irrational but real, because the unconscious does not distinguish between internal conflict and external threat. Envy often disguises itself as fear. When people say they feel intimidated by another, it is rarely because the person poses true danger. More often, it is because they sense qualities they themselves long for, but have buried: courage, creativity, clarity, or strength. To see it in another is to be reminded of its absence within. And because it is easier to criticize than to confront oneself, they turn that insecurity into fear, resentment, or even hostility. This is why some people, without lifting a hand or raising a voice, provoke tension in others. They serve as mirrors, not mirrors of appearance, but mirrors of the unconscious, reflecting back the traits others try desperately to suppress. It is easier to label you as threatening than to admit their own lack. It is easier to fear you than to face themselves. Jung warned that projection blinds us. To see only the shadow in others is to remain ignorant of the shadow within. But for those who carry presence, authenticity, or power, this blindness often comes at a cost. They become targets of insecurity, treated with suspicion, not for what they do, but for what they reveal. Fear, in this sense, is rarely personal. It is a reflection when others fear you without knowing why. They are looking not at you, but at the parts of themselves they dare not confront. You are the mirror, and mirrors, especially honest ones, have always been unsettling. Human beings are social creatures, but this truth carries a darker implication. To survive, ancient tribes needed cohesion. Safety depended not only on the sharpness of the spear, but on the unity of the group. Those who strayed too far from custom threatened that unity, and in the harsh world of survival, threat was synonymous with danger. This instinct still pulses in the modern mind. Whatever does not conform is often treated as suspicious, dangerous, or even monstrous. Carl Jung recognized this in his warnings about the collective unconscious, the deep layer of the psyche shared across humanity. Within it lie the instincts of the herd, the pull towards sameness, and the fear of difference. To step outside the group's unspoken rules is to risk becoming a target of projection, exclusion, or even violence. Fear of the different is not rational. It is tribal memory echoing across centuries. History shows this pattern with painful clarity. When Galileo turned his telescope to the skies and dared to announce that Earth was not the center of the universe, he was not merely presenting a scientific claim, he was challenging the shared belief that bound his society together. For that act of intellectual difference, he was branded dangerous, forced to recant, and placed under house arrest. His crime was not astronomy, it was nonconformity. Centuries later, civil rights leaders who demanded equality were met not only with political resistance, but with deep irrational fear. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, carried no weapon, yet he was treated as a threat of the highest order. Why? Because he disturbed the equilibrium of a society built on hierarchy and control. His difference was not tolerated because it revealed truths that the collective preferred to deny. The same mechanism punishes whistleblowers. Those who reveal uncomfortable truths about governments, corporations, or powerful institutions are often demonized more than those who commit the actual crimes. It is not their evidence that sparks fear. It is their refusal to conform to silence by breaking the collective agreement to look away. They become symbols of danger. In modern life, this tribal instinct plays out across new arenas. On social media, conformity is policed not by kings or priests, but by mobs of ordinary users. To say the wrong word, to hold the wrong view, or to Step outside the shifting boundaries of acceptability is to invite backlash. Cancel culture, in its rawest form, is not just moral critique, it is the ancient instinct of the tribe punishing those who threaten cohesion. The fear directed at nonconformists is rarely about their actual words or actions. It is about the collective's terror of fracture, of difference, of disruption. Jung warned that mass psychology is dangerous precisely because it overrides individual thought. When the crowd rules, people cease to think as individuals and instead act as a herd. The herd does not reason, it reacts. It does not judge on evidence, it judges on instinct. And the greatest instinct of the herd is to protect itself from whatever does not fit. This explains why the quiet thinker in a meeting may unsettle colleagues, why the unconventional artist is dismissed before their work is understood, or why the person who refuses to follow shallow trends is quietly excluded. To be different, in any form, is to carry the unconscious stigma of danger. The collective, whether a tribe, a society, or an online mob, feels safer without disruption. But history also shows that it is precisely these disruptors, the Galileos, the civil rights leaders, the whistleblowers, who move humanity forward. They are feared not because they are wrong, but because they expose the fragility of what the collective believes to be unshakable. Their difference forces the group to confront itself, and that confrontation is rarely welcomed. To fear the different is to reveal insecurity. It is to admit that the collective identity rests on fragile foundations, and so those who dare to stand apart are cast as dangerous, not because they are, but because the herd cannot survive their truth. Fear is not always a rejection. Sometimes it is a disguised form of reverence. Human beings may never admit it openly, but often the people they claim to be intimidated by are the very ones they respect the most. Fear, in these cases, is not born of danger, but of recognition. The recognition of strength, authenticity, and depth. Think of the figure who enters a room and says nothing, yet commands attention. Their silence unsettles not because it signals weakness, but because it radiates self-possession. Confidence that does not need to be shouted is the rarest form of power. Jung might have said such a person embodies integration. Someone who has confronted their own shadow and therefore cannot be easily manipulated by others. Those who have not done this work often feel both fear and admiration in their presence. History is filled with examples of this paradox. Socrates, who lived with humility and asked questions rather than giving orders, inspired unease in Athens. He was accused of corrupting the youth, but what truly frightened his accusers was the depth of his thought. His calm refusal to bow to convention was a silent accusation against their superficiality. They feared him because they respected him, because he represented a higher form of integrity they could not reach or consider. Leaders such as Abraham Lincoln or Nelson Mandela neither relied on brutality to establish authority. Instead, they carried a quiet resilience that commanded fear in rivals. Their moral independence, their unwillingness to bend even under pressure, created a presence that unsettled the powerful. This was not fear of violence, but fear of being confronted by truth. Respect and fear became inseparable because strength of character makes both possible at once. Psychological studies on authority and dominance echo this reality. Research shows that individuals with high confidence, steady eye contact, and calm composure often trigger stronger reactions in others than those who display aggression. People sense power not only in force but in restraint. True dominance is not about shouting the loudest. It is about carrying an unshakable inner center that others cannot penetrate. The very calmness of such people acts as a silent threat to those whose security is fragile. Charisma works in a similar way. The most magnetic individuals in history, whether artists, prophets, or visionaries, often provoked fear alongside admiration. Charisma is disruptive. It pulls people out of their ordinary state and forces them to reckon with something larger. That disruption feels like danger because it challenges the ordinary fabric of social life. Yet beneath the fear lies respect for the rare presence of someone who embodies conviction, vision, or truth. This explains why even today, People often describe certain individuals as intimidating when what they really mean is impressive. The independent thinker in a workplace, the person who refuses to gossip, or the one who remains calm in conflict, is often feared. But that fear is a mask. What it hides is respect for qualities others lack. Composure, clarity, and strength. Fear, in this sense, becomes an unspoken acknowledgement. To fear someone's presence without reason is to admit they possess something undeniable, something that cannot be ignored. It is an instinctive bow before strength, even if the conscious mind disguises it as discomfort. The silent threat, then, is not about hostility or danger, it is about depth. People fear confidence because it exposes their insecurity. They fear independence because it highlights their dependence. They fear authenticity because it unmasks their pretenses. Fear is the shadow cast by respect, a distorted reflection of qualities the world cannot easily name, but cannot help but recognize. And so, when others fear you without knowing why, it may not be a rejection at all. It may be the highest compliment, the unconscious recognition of strength, cloaked in the language of unease. If Carl Jung were alive today, he would likely see the modern world as a vast stage upon which the unconscious plays itself out in plain sight. Fear, projection, and the shadow have not disappeared. They have only changed form. What once played out in village squares and royal courts now unfolds in offices, on social media feeds, and in the endless theatre of politics. In the workplace, the dynamics are striking. The loud, extroverted figure is often seen as harmless, even when their words carry little weight. But the quiet individual, the one who listens more than they speak, is often treated with suspicion. Silence unsettles because it creates space for projection. The quiet colleague becomes whatever others imagine them to be: arrogant, judgmental, mysterious, or even threatening. They may simply be thoughtful, yet their very restraint evokes unease. This is the modern version of the stranger archetype, still feared not for action but for difference. In relationships, the same principle appears. Authenticity is dangerous because it removes the comfortable illusions upon which many bonds are built. A person who speaks uncomfortable truths in a family or friendship circle may be ostracized, not because they are cruel, but because they disturb the unspoken agreement to keep certain realities buried. Jung argued that people fear authenticity because it forces them to confront their own shadow. To be fully oneself in a world built on masks is to invite both respect and resentment. Nowhere is this clearer than on social media. The digital world has amplified projection to a level Jung could scarcely have imagined. Online platforms function as collective mirrors, reflecting not truth but the unconscious fears and desires of millions. Here, a single tweet or post can spark outrage, not because of its objective content, but because it activates insecurities in the crowd. The phenomenon of cancel culture reveals this dynamic vividly. What is punished is often not genuine wrongdoing, but deviation from the herd's fragile consensus. To say what others repress, or to live in a way that exposes the illusions of the collective, is to become a lightning rod for fear and hostility. Whistleblowers provide another modern example. Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning revealed truths about governments that were uncomfortable to face. They were not feared because they were violent, but because their authenticity exposed corruption and secrecy. Their existence was a challenge to the collective illusion of safety and control. Jung would likely argue that such figures embody the rebel archetype, activating the unconscious fear of disruption that resides in every society. Even in ordinary social groups, the mechanics are visible. The person who refuses to gossip, who avoids shallow trends, or who resists the pressure to conform, often becomes the target of subtle exclusion. Their independence provokes insecurity in others. To stand apart is to hold a mirror to the crowd, reflecting its dependency, its pretenses, and its weakness. The group responds with fear disguised as mockery or suspicion. Modern politics, too, thrives on the manipulation of unconscious fear. Leaders rise by projecting the shadow onto outsiders, convincing the public that the enemy is not within but beyond, foreigners, dissenters, minorities, or critics. the mass psychology Jung warned about is now weaponized through algorithms, news cycles, and propaganda campaigns. What people repress collectively, violence, greed, corruption, they project onto convenient scapegoats. Fear becomes not only a psychological mechanism, but a political tool in today's world. Authenticity is perhaps the greatest threat. To be authentic is to refuse to conform to the projections of others. It is to resist the masks demanded by digital culture and mass psychology. But authenticity, though feared, is also desperately needed, for without it, societies collapse into paranoia, endlessly hunting shadows rather than facing themselves. The modern Jungian lens reveals this paradox clearly. Fear in today's world is rarely about true danger. It is about the collective, unconscious in turmoil, lashing out at whatever disturbs its fragile illusions. Those who are feared without cause are often the ones who live closest to the truth. Carl Jung believed that the greatest danger to a person was not their darkness but their refusal to face it. The shadow, he argued, cannot be destroyed. It can only be integrated. To reject it is to remain fragmented. To embrace it is to become whole. What does it mean to embrace the shadow? It is not about indulging in cruelty or glorifying destructive impulses. It is about acknowledgement. It is about bringing into the light what we habitually keep buried. Our anger, envy, pride, fear, and ambition. These are not enemies to be denied, but energies to be recognized and redirected. Jung warned that what we repress does not vanish. It grows stronger in the dark. But when we confront it, when we claim it as part of ourselves, it loses its grip and becomes a source of strength. History shows the difference between those who repress their shadow and those who integrate it. Leaders who denied their inner darkness often became consumed by it, projecting violence onto others in catastrophic ways. But those who faced themselves directly carried an authenticity that others could not ignore. Their charisma was not a performance. It was the natural aura of wholeness. Consider why figures like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. inspired such devotion. They were not perfect men. They struggled with anger, fear, and doubt. But unlike many, they did not pretend to be flawless. They acknowledged their human weaknesses and transformed them into fuel for conviction. Their presence commanded attention, not because they were free of darkness, but because they had made peace with it. This integration gave them resilience, clarity, and the kind of authenticity that naturally evokes both respect and fear, psychologically. This process is known as shadow work. It begins with brutal honesty, asking yourself what you resent in others and recognizing those traits in yourself. It means admitting to envy when you feel it, to rage when it arises, to selfishness when it whispers. Instead of denying these impulses, you acknowledge them as part of the human condition. By doing so, you prevent them from unconsciously controlling you. What once appeared as weakness becomes fuel for self-awareness. The practical effect of this is profound. People who integrate their shadow exude a different energy. They no longer waste effort hiding behind masks, and this liberation gives their presence weight. Their words carry conviction because they are not diluted by pretense. Their confidence is not arrogance, but the quiet certainty of someone who knows themselves fully. And while this presence can evoke fear in others, it also inspires respect because authenticity is magnetic in a world drowning in false appearances. Even in ordinary life, this transformation is visible. The person who accepts their flaws without shame becomes unshakable in social situations. The individual who acknowledges their own potential for aggression no longer fears confrontation. The one who admits to ambition can pursue goals without apology. In each case, integration replaces repression, and with it comes a power that others instinctively recognize. To embrace the shadow is to transform fear into strength. Those who resist this path remain fragmented, their lives dictated by unconscious projections. But those who accept their whole being, light and dark, noble and flawed, become larger than life. They carry an aura of inevitability, as though nothing in them is hidden, and therefore nothing in them can be controlled. Jung called this the path to individuation, the process of becoming one's true self. It is not an easy road, for it demands courage to face the parts of ourselves we most despise. But the reward is authenticity, charisma, and presence. And when others fear you without knowing why, it may be because you have walked this path, you have embraced your shadow, and in doing so, you embody a wholeness that unsettles those still running from their own. To live authentically is to accept a burden. The burden is not only solitude, but fear directed toward you by those who cannot understand, cannot explain, and cannot accept the presence you carry. Some people will always fear what they cannot comprehend. Rare minds, rare souls, do not move unnoticed through the world. They leave ripples, and ripples disturb the still water of conformity. Carl Jung believed that those who embrace their shadow, who integrate their unconscious into wholeness, inevitably stand apart. They are no longer fragmented like the majority. They do not wear the masks society demands. They do not hide their contradictions or bury their truths. Such individuals become both magnetic and unsettling, for they remind the world of what it hides from itself. This has always been the price of rarity. Socrates was condemned for corrupting the youth, though all he offered were questions that forced Athens to confront itself. Giordano Bruno was burned for imagining a universe larger than dogma could allow. Nietzsche was ridiculed and dismissed in life, only to be feared later for the truths his philosophy unearthed. These figures were not feared for violence, but for authenticity. They revealed realities too heavy for the collective to bear, and so they were treated as threats. In modern times, the pattern repeats: whistleblowers, dissidents, visionaries, and even everyday individuals who dare to live differently encounter suspicion. A person who refuses to compromise their integrity often walks alone because their presence unsettles those who live by convenience and denial. In friendships, workplaces, or families, the rare mind becomes the one who is too intense, too serious, or too different. Yet beneath these labels lies fear, the fear of being exposed to truths others would rather avoid. The temptation is always to shrink, to soften, to conform in order to escape this burden. But Jung would argue that to deny one's rarity is to deny oneself. Authenticity is not a curse, it is a responsibility. The rare mind carries the task of embodying what others repress, of living out what others only imagine. To walk this path is to invite fear, but also to embody freedom. There is a paradox here. The very qualities that make others fear you are also the qualities that give your life depth. Presence, independence, conviction, these unsettle because they are powerful. Fear becomes a kind of silent respect, an unconscious acknowledgement of strength. Those who fear you without cause may in truth be recognizing what they lack in themselves. They see in you not danger, but a mirror, one that reflects their unclaimed potential, their hidden insecurities, their own shadow. And so the question is not how to escape this fear, but how to carry it. To be rare is to be misunderstood. To be whole is to be feared. Yet this fear is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of authenticity. It means you are living at a depth where others feel the tremors of their own unconscious. The price of being rare is steep: isolation, suspicion, resistance. But the reward is greater, for to live authentically, even when feared, is to stand as a reminder of what humanity could be. It is to embody truth in a world that runs from it. It is to become the mirror through which others, if they dare, might glimpse themselves more honestly. Fear is often a mirror. When people fear you without knowing why, it may be because you carry what they cannot face within themselves. This is not a curse, it is your calling. And though the path of rarity is heavy, it is also luminous, for it is the path of authenticity, the path of wholeness, the path of the self fully realized,